guys, welcome. Tonight we're going to be talking all about boundaries, and I'm going to give you all the ins and outs about boundaries, as well as a step process to help you with implementing them. And what's great is that because this is a live recorded webinar, I have people that are going to be asking questions, and you guys are welcome to ask anything you'd like in the chat, and I will do my best to answer every single question. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Nichole Coyne. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a therapy group practice owner, as well as a coach and consultant for high achievers and perfectionists. I help you start living in your life rather than running through it. And one of the things that I want to start this presentation off with is a quote that I absolutely love, which is, "Givers have to set limits because takers rarely do." And what that quote actually represents is this need to be very aware of where our boundaries exist and how we live in different types of capacity. And I just want you to be able to think about that as we're talking about these different areas. This is a really hard, difficult topic that we're talking about. So make sure that you are taking one bite at a time with how much you are taking on with this and how much you can do for making changes for internal and external boundaries. Let's go. One of the things that happens with high achievers and perfectionists is that we overgive a lot. And so throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about this constant need of overgiving. I'm going to be talking about some of the reasons that go behind why we're not setting boundaries and standards for ourselves. But I'm also going to be talking about what we do and how we can set up better boundaries for ourselves. Let's jump into some of the reasons that perfectionists typically struggle with setting boundaries. One of the first ways that perfectionists really, and high achievers, when I say perfectionists, please know that I mean both. I mean these as the same group of individuals who are really struggling with doing things that set really high expectations for themselves, right? So perfectionists work unremittingly to meet expectations and standards for themselves. They do this in all areas of their lives. And a lot of the reasons that individuals become perfectionists or are perfectionists is because of the ways in which they were raised, they view their world, they feel like their worth is in society, how they identify their worth and their accomplishments in society. There's actually a plethora of reasons. It could be due to trauma, it could be due to a lot of different things. So let's go through a couple of the different reasons. Doing too much for others. This is people pleasing. This is the need of overgiving. This is that identification that in order to feel worthy, I must constantly be doing for somebody else. And a lot of the times this shows up pretty regularly in childhood. You know, if we only got praise when we were accomplishing something or being an easy child or being that kid that always got good grades or won the soccer game, that praise really makes an identification of how we show up within our lives. This other piece about people pleasing, and I saw a video not too long ago and it was really good, and it said the difference between people pleasing and kindness, one of the biggest differences is the compulsion and the need to receive things back, right? So with people pleasing, it almost becomes a compulsion that we're working towards, right? Like we need to do this in order to meet that standard and expectation that somebody or we have set for ourselves. With kindness is doing something and not expecting anything in return. And this can be really helpful to differentiate these two in a couple different ways. And we're going to talk about it as I go through some of this boundary stuff. But one of the things that I really want you to understand here too is that a lot of perfectionists, a lot of high achievers, a lot of givers identify as people pleasers. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in order to start making some headway in the other direction, to start calming down some of those things, we need to talk about boundaries. We need to talk about some of these areas that need some barriers so that you can protect and conserve your energy and your time. Okay, number 3, perfectionists believe that their worth is solely based on accomplishments. I've mentioned this, but let's go into this for a second. Perfectionists truly identify that their worth changes day to day. It doesn't. Your worth does not change day to day. It's not about getting 50 things done one day and 5 things done the other day, that you're less worthy on the day you only got 5 things done and more worthy on the day you got 50 things done. That's a construct. That's an internal narrative construct that we've created, but that doesn't identify that is the only way that our worth is valued, is experienced, right? I want you to think about the ways in which you start to identify your worth and your accomplishments. We're going to talk about setting up boundaries today internally too, and I have a step-by-step process that I'm going to give you that's going to be really, really helpful for you to understand how you can start setting up these boundaries and how it can make a really big difference with the way that you're interpersonally showing up within your external life. The other big thing that I actually see with a lot of perfectionists and high achievers is having too many boundaries. Having too many boundaries looks like you are very rigid in your thinking. And a lot of perfectionists also lean into this need to be very structured. So this is like the athlete, if you want a really good example of this. So I have a couple of individuals that I've worked with in the past. And I'll say, okay, well, what do you do for fun? And this is like the hardest question. It stumps them, right? Because they're like, what do you mean? Like, I go out every once in a while. And I'm like, no. Like, what do you do that you enjoy, or what do you do that's not productive? And they have so many boundaries that they're lacking connection and vulnerability with a lot of people. They have so many boundaries that they're not able to just really relax and calm down and be present in their space. And when we have too many boundaries in different areas, it makes it really hard to find some of those connection spaces. It makes it even more difficult to begin to make adaptations on how we show up in our lives. And so it's not that we have to remove all these different boundaries, it's just that we have to make some adjustments. So for example, I was working with this client, and she came in, she was struggling with different types of perfectionism, with high achiever, like that high achieving stance. And she just was so uncomfortable in her life and so angry in her life. And she's a runner. And I was like, well, how many miles are you typically running? Because I run too, but I'm not, I'm not doing 13, okay? And she was saying somewhere between 13 and 25 miles a week or on a Sunday. And I'm like, wow, why? Like, are we training for something? She's like, no, it's just what I do. And I said, well, do you enjoy it? She goes, sometimes. I go, well, why do you do it? She goes, because I think I have to. And I'm like, okay, well, what is it about running that is making you feel connected to physical activity? She says, not much, other than if I don't meet that expectation, then I don't feel like I'm accomplishing. I don't feel as worthy. Makes sense. But there's a big difference between running 3 or 4 miles to kind of get it out versus running 13 to 25 to overextend yourself, right? And then the boundary that needs to be set there is more of an internal boundary. So that's why we're going to talk about internal boundaries a lot today too. Because although a couple boundaries could be pulled off, there's actually a couple that we can add in there to understand what's different. Just to let you know too, this client ended up deciding that they were going to go to a gym with other people where there was running and all kinds of different strength training. And it was one of the best things that she ever did for herself. It made a huge difference in the way that she connected to her whole life and seeing those physical boundaries, because she was overextending herself all the time. One of the communication techniques that I like to talk about too a lot in understanding boundaries, and I'm doing a whole presentation on communication techniques on April 18th. It's going to be a great follow-up to this, because the boundary setup is a beautiful starting point before learning those communication techniques. So if you can, April 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to talk about communication. I'm going to give a lot of different tips and tricks about that. But one of the things that I really like starting off boundaries with and teaching individuals about boundaries is asking your people, the people that you regularly communicate with, are you looking for a solution or are you looking to vent? And there's nothing wrong with asking this question, but sometimes this can catch people off guard when they're not expecting that type of question, right? And so when we start off a lot of our conversations and start understanding different types of relationships and setting this like better precedent of a boundary, what we're actually doing here is we're seeking to understand the other person. So if my husband comes home and he's had a really tough day and he just starts word vomiting all over me, right? Because he's had a tough day, I have to kind of go, okay, wait, what is he looking for? And then I have to ask him, do you want some solution for this? Or would you like me to kind of just sit back and say, wow, that was a really crappy day. Do you still want to have burgers and make ice cream floats later? Like what is that next thing that I can do to provide you the compassion? And when we're starting to set up our boundaries, this communication technique can come in real handy, even for individuals that you don't have close interpersonal relationships with. When I worked in the hospital system, I would have nurses come up to me all the time, and it would be a bunch of things that weren't my issue, but they would start dumping all these different things on me. And I'm like, okay, would you like a solution here? Or would you like to just tell me all about it? And 99.9% of the time, they would give me a really nasty look, or they'd be really upset with me, but they'd go, I just kind of want to complain about it. I'm like, okay, that's fine. You can absolutely complain about it. That's what I'm here for. That's half my job, is being a social worker and hearing your complaints. So that's okay. Utilize this. Utilize that communication technique, especially starting in your interpersonal relationships. It will make a huge difference in the ways that you start to communicate and leading into how you're going to communicate your boundaries, which we're going to talk more about on the 18th. 2 books that I want to give you guys as recommendation if this topic really, really resonates with you. One of the books I'm pretty sure that a good amount of people in this room have probably heard of, The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown. It talks a lot about boundary items. It's really, really helpful. And the other one is Setting Boundaries, Finding Peace by Nichole. And these are 2 really good books that lay out a very good understanding of like what's happening when we're starting boundaries, what we want this to look like, how we can show up, how we can communicate and engage. Especially Nidra's book. Nidra's book is phenomenal because she takes real life examples and she breaks it down and she shows you step by step what is the most helpful way to start overcoming this. So before we go into how to do this, we're going to talk about the different types of boundaries. Okay. So there's 4 that I'm going to identify. I'm 99.9% certain that there's probably more than 4. But these are 4 of the most popular and the most helpful ones to understand. I'm going to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of back and forth because some of this literature is just absolutely perfect for identifying what this boundary actually is. And to be honest with you too, because I'm a therapist and because I'm a coach, I don't always think about like exactly what the definition is. I just can see where they start pulling up and what needs to be pulled out here. And the more you start to understand them, the more you're going to see that. And you may see it in others before you see it in yourself. And that's even better because you can start identifying it elsewhere before you start doing it for you. So number 1, internal. This protects you from you and others from you, right? So protects you and others from yourself. I think everybody thinks that external boundaries are the hardest one, but this one is the hard one. It's the hardest one for perfectionists because perfectionists have some of the loudest inner critics, inner narratives of most personalities, right? You run off criticism. You run off this drive of, I need to be doing things a certain way. I need to have all these expectations met. You're failing if you're not accomplishing, right? So let's look at internal boundaries a little bit more. It serves as a filtration mechanism between your emotions, feelings, and deciding what to do with them. Deciding how to express feelings, reactions, emotions. Deciding how to hold on to certain emotions or feelings. This is where a lot of perfectionists get stuck. They struggle with sitting with heavy emotions, and anybody who identifies with any remote level of perfectionism understands how hard it is to sit with perfectionism and to sit with a heavy emotion. Perfectionism doesn't love depression. You're not doing anything. Perfectionism might like anxiety. Maybe your form of anxiety either looks like analysis paralysis or it looks like, let's drive 350 miles an hour in our mind and see how many things that we get done for that day. Okay, let's move to external. Protects you from insults and injuries from the outside. This is what external boundaries look like. Think of this when someone yells at you in traffic or says something awful to hurt you, towards you, or about you. I love using the traffic example because it's such a human condition to have this, especially if you live in high volume traffic areas, right? So you see this, whether you're engaged with it personally or you just see it on the outside, you see external boundaries a lot. So I want you to think of that as an external boundary. When I worked in the hospitals and I was working on some really tough cases in med surg and neuro and then ED, which is the ER. we had to put holds on babies sometimes when we knew that a baby was being abused or hurt in some way, or we had this idea that that baby was being abused, which meant I had to tell parents a lot of times that they needed to leave the premise or that they were not allowed to see their babies. A lot of my techniques that I utilize today with setting boundaries and understanding different types of projections and understanding different ways that people are showing up are based on the exact techniques that I was using in the hospital. The dumpster fire trash can method, that literally comes from working in the hospital. That was a technique that I used to help me not take on the projections of all these very angry parents or people. So when we're talking about external boundaries, I want you to think about how something is coming at you and how you are internally trying to protect that. If this helps you to think of yourself as a house and the external boundaries are kind of the barrier of the house or a fence around your house, it's a good way to think of it when we're talking about external boundaries. It typically has to deal with others. Physical. This is the easiest one to tangibly see. This is just touching. When I'm working with a therapy client, a lot of the things that we will work on in the beginning is I want to understand which boundaries are really, really significant for them and which ones really aren't significant for them. I don't have a lot of perfectionists that like being hugged. Maybe that's an identification response to trauma, maybe it's something else, but a lot of the times they like having their bubble, they like having their space, they like being in that space. They really struggle with wanting to have that experience too until they start to identify with connecting with someone, right? Because their love language may very well be physical touch, but they might not like it from just anybody and whoever, which I think we can all identify with, especially after COVID. I think we've all just kind of shifted away from as much hugging as there used to be. This boundary tells you when to set limits and how to protect yourself, right? Think about it. If you are out walking around somewhere and somebody kind of gets a little too close to you, that boundary starts kind of signaling. This is a really easy one to pick up on because it's like, excuse me, can you give me a little bit of space? Like you're kind of on top of me. When we struggle with setting that kind of boundary, we're really having a little bit of misidentification with what we're giving out versus what we're needing, right? What we might be needing here is extra space, but if we don't feel comfortable in saying that, we need to kind of reinforce some of that communication skills and assertiveness in order to feel more comfortable in that situation. Let's see, really, I wonder why is it true for me? How do you know you're an overachiever? You've already read the suggested materials. Just out of curiosity, would you be here if you weren't? Overachievers are constantly looking to feel like they need to do more in order to be worthy. There's never enough. There's never any celebrations. There's always this need to constantly be driving. And I want you to think about that in a couple different areas of your life. But if you really sit in that place of, I need to have more in order to feel worthy and valued, we're talking to an overachiever. A perfectionist is not the person that actually has all their stuff together. It's the person that wants to have all their stuff together. Let's see. So interesting. The only person that comes in my bubble is my husband. And that's not even all the time. My friends know I'm not a hugger. Yep. I hear you. I totally hear you. This is something I work a lot with individual clients with because I don't want them to become more of a hugger. That's not our goal, but it's about being able to communicate the boundary that they feel the best about, right? I had one of my coaching clients come and visit me in the beginning of this year, and we had this lovely interaction. And the first thing that I asked him was, can I give you a hug? And it wasn't for anything, like if he had said no to me, I would have been like, okay, no problem. But it was because I feel a strong connection to you. We've done a lot of work together. Is it okay if I give you this hug? And that communication system is one of the best things that you can do for high achievers, perfectionists. And guys, anybody, people that struggle with neurodivergency or struggle in certain different types of areas or have had pretty bad past trauma physically in some way, it's important to ask that, right? This can be all about communication stuff. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's refocus. Thank you for your questions and your insight though. Okay, let's do the last one. This one's my favorite because when I learned about this one, it just clicked for me. It just made so much darn sense. as to understanding some of the things that I almost said what I was doing incorrectly, but it's not what I was doing incorrectly. It was what I was not aligning with my needs. Okay, so there's a difference here. Temporal. Spending too much time thinking about, imagining, worrying about, or dreading the future can cause anxiety and prevent us from living in the moment, as well as the past. I want you to think of temporal boundaries as right here. It is 7:21 on a Monday evening and you're with me. You're in this present moment. Anything behind us is behind us. Anything in front of us is in front of us, right? If we can really begin to start to see, like, what are the boundaries that I need to create related to time for me? What does that start to actually look like? This is such a huge, important boundary, you guys. This is one I'm going to talk about a little bit more too, but especially for perfectionists, because perfectionists, the ones that I get the wonderful opportunity to work with, they live 3 years in the future, three weeks to 3 years. And then when they're stressed out, they live very far in the past. And when they go to lay down at night, when you start experiencing that high functioning anxiety, what's happening is that you are holding on to something that happened 10 years ago that's not that important, that is just getting amplified in your mind. This is, if you guys need any support with this, go back to my inner critic presentation on YouTube. Listen to that monger, listen to understanding that high functioning anxiety. Because what's happening here is that we're going too far back in a temporal boundary, and it's not supportive of our needs right now. Nobody cares that you messed up on a presentation when you were in 9th grade. They just don't. Nobody's thinking about that. But when you're amplifying that, and when your monger gets loud, when all these things are happening, you're crossing over that temporal boundary. Temporal boundaries are really, really important too for when we're working with individuals who have trauma. When they start to go backwards and flashbacks and PTSD and some of these other things start to come up, we're now living in their brains in a different way. They're living in their brains in a different way. Me as the therapist, I'm sitting there and I'm trying to help understand and be a part of that process while keeping them in the present of understanding the temporal boundary. Make sense? Yeah, that one's my favorite. I like working with that one a lot because I think it gives a lot of room for growth. How do you effectively get that over-processing to stop? Just telling myself to stop doesn't really work. Yeah. Is it serving you? Is that over-processing actually doing anything for you? This is the thing with temporal boundaries. And I'm going to give you step-by-steps on some of these different things, but this is the thing with temporal boundaries and then that high functioning anxiety add-on, right? Is that we think, perfectionists typically think, I'm not going to just group us all into one category, although I'd like to. I'd like us to all sit in a room together and do that. We think that by overthinking, overprocessing, overanalyzing a situation, it will make it easier to handle, and that's really not the truth. It's just not. You can overanalyze and overthink as much as you'd like, but the only person that you are going to empty out is you and what you have available for accessing. Your time and your energy are the two things you cannot get back in this life. If you are really working on trying to maintain and understand where this is going, it's not always going to help to be like, no, just stop it, just cut it out. But what could be helping is asking yourself, how is this serving me? What is this doing for me right in this minute? And it's one of the most important questions that we do not ask ourselves enough, right? It's the same thing with boundaries. How is this lack of boundary not serving me? And how is this excess of a boundary not serving me? And how do I have to mediate between the two? That can be a really helpful question for you to go, you know what? Like, this just isn't worth all this time and energy. I'd rather put my energy into something fun and go kayaking and kayak fishing with my husband, right? I'd rather find something else where my energy can sit in a healthy place. Great question. Okay, how do we know when we need to set a boundary? Real quick. These are mine. These are my rules. I did not get these from any books. I did not get these from any place. I'm not going to hit every single identifier, but I'm going to hit the ones that I think are really, really most noticeable for perfectionists and high achievers. But please don't quote me that these are the only ones. I'm not being rigid with this. Be flexible with me on some of these pieces. There's a lot of cofactors included here. So let's do internal and personal and then external. So how do we know when we need to set a boundary internally and personally? What's going on here? Overdriving yourself and burning yourself out. Number one way, right? You start feeling a little bit crispy, you start feeling a little bit burnt out, you're a little overdriven, you're way too fatigued. You come home after a situation, an interaction, a work day, something, and you just feel like you literally have no energy left. That's a great flag. Increasing internal criticism for not accomplishing more. Being a real not nice person to yourself because you didn't get more done. That is another flag. That's a flag. Restrictions that prevent joy, happiness, relaxation, and release. Yeah, sorry. If you're not having any type of joy, relaxation, release, happiness in your life, this is kind of another flag that we have to identify as this may mean that we need more boundaries. Rigid thinking patterns, the inability to let others in. This is what perpetuates a lot of the depression with perfectionism. We isolate and we become depressed, right? We literally feel like we are just locked in this area. And that is another signaling tool that we need to utilize to understand what boundaries need to be set and which ones need to be readjusted. Psychological symptoms, anxiety, depression, and let's add on to this whole little category, physical symptoms. Yeah. Jaw pain, headaches, chronic pain, physical pain, back pain, any of these different types of things. Yes, they can be perpetuated by different injuries and whatnot. However, specifically jaw pain, neck pain, head pain, those types of things, that's clenching. Clenching, typically too much cortisol. What's that? Stress. That's that stress hormone, right? When you start noticing some of these symptoms come up, this is a really good flag for you to start identifying that you need to set some different types of boundaries. Externally, discomfort within a relationship. So feeling like you've been taken advantage of, feeling like you have to monitor a lot of the things that you say, feeling like the relationship lacks symbiosis. And just real quick, what is symbiosis? So symbiosis is that when two parts actually provide equality to each other. So I want you to think of, what is it called? A menorah? No, that's not it. There's a fish in the ocean, and it's literally the name of it's leaving my mind. But it's a fish that cleans sharks, and the sharks won't eat it because it cleans sharks. If you guys know what it is, please drop it in the message box. And this is a symbiotic relationship, right? The shark won't eat this fish because this fish actually does a benefit to the shark. And the benefit that the fish is getting is that it's getting food, it's getting nourishment. So when we have this type of symbiotic relationship, it's that two people are showing up in pretty equal value, right? And it's not a tick for tack type thing, but it's I can lean on you for some things, you can lean on me for some things. When relationships are very one-sided, it makes it really difficult to feel like there's any equality in that relationship, which causes more difficulties with the way that we see our relationship, more difficulties with boundaries. Overexhaustion when spending time, remora. Thank you. Overexhaustion when spending time with someone. You need a lot of rest and alone time after repeatedly spending time with someone. This is a really good signaling agent. And I don't mean in like you guys had a super good time, you had a blast afterwards. I mean like you've exerted so much or you've now taken on that person's problem that this is what you're feeling all the time. This is a really good flag for why you need to set a boundary. Resentment, anger, frustration. Feeling like the relationship is one-sided. Okay, so those are just some of the external, how do we know we need to set a boundary? So this is what I think is going to be most helpful because this is what I actually like doing individually one-to-one with clients, is that instead of giving you a whole bunch of techniques to use, I want us to use more of a step-by-step process. And I want us to use two examples, so one for internal, one for external, of how you can start setting up these boundaries in a really positive and helpful way. And I'm going to do this in two different ways, right? So I'm going to do it with internal boundaries and external boundaries. And what we're really going to do is we're going to break this down. So let's go through the steps first. Number one, identify why you need or feel like you need to set the boundary and write it down. I don't love journaling, you guys, but I will tell you that one of the things that is really important to me, especially as a perfectionist, especially as a high achiever, especially as someone who needs to really kind of process some things out before I make a decision about something, and I'm a very decisive person, you can ask anybody that knows me, is I write things down a lot. I understand what's going on for me, and that's why I write in this one too. Write it down. Why do you need to have this boundary? Why is it important? What is coming up here? This is also a really good time to process with a therapist, somebody that you really trust and support, like a friend. But a lot of the times too, if we're starting to have that feeling that like that same person, that intimate relationship or that friend that we have is that reason for the boundary, do not have that same conversation with them, right? What we're going to do is we're going to start internally by setting up this boundary. This is where the influence of positive supports come in. That's what I was saying with the therapist, with any type of support agent, with the coach, with whoever. Number 2, decide on the limit. Okay, so what is the limit of this boundary? A really clear example of this is thinking about the exercise, right? Like if that one client that I was working with who's over exercising all the time, if the limit was, hey, instead of 5 days a week running, let's bring it down to 4, and then let's bring it down to 3, and then let's bring it down to 2, and let's find supplemental things that we can do in between there, or let's go to a different gym and see how that works. That's us setting the limit on that, right? Same for different types of conversations that you can't have with everybody, right? Unfortunately, we have different opinions on some things, and sometimes we can have really powerful conversations about that, but then other times we can't. And when it comes to family systems, this is one of the best places to have some of those boundaries, right? If we can't agree on religion or politics or some of those things, let's just leave them off the table. Let's have that boundary there, because there might need to be a really defined boundary there, and maybe that's the limit. But maybe some of the other limits look a little bit differently. Sometimes I will have some of my friends like call me and want some support, or somebody needs something, and I'll say to them, hey, I have a pretty full day today. I don't have the capacity to show up for you, but I want to have this conversation with you. We just can't do it today. Would it be okay if we did this conversation another time? And typically what I get is, yeah, no problem. Hope you have a good presentation. Hope you have a good time. I have to be able to maintain that boundary, understand that limit, and recognize it. This is a good time to make a pros and cons list, right? So after we have identified why, we're going to do that pros and cons list. Like why? What are the pros of doing this? What are the cons of doing this? I guess I'm going to bet too that when you start doing those cons, it's going to be a lot of fear-based thinking, because a lot of it is more about the anticipation that goes into it, the anticipation that goes into how I'm going to set this boundary. Good time to make pros and cons list. Also good place to communicate it. This is where in step 2 is where I want you to start thinking about communicating the boundary that you need to set. And this can look like having a conversation with a friend or a loved one. Like, hey, I'm noticing that this conversation about X is affecting me a lot more than I'd like it to. And if it's okay with you, I'd really hope that we could just not have as many conversations about this topic. Number 3, decide how you will sit with the discomfort. This is the hardest part. I'd like to say that I'm completely biased, but I even got a couple questions from Instagram today on my stories of people were like, what do you do when you sit with all the discomfort after you've set the boundary? And I'm like, yep, okay. So this is one of the hardest parts. And a lot of it is because it's really hard to not feel all the guilt and shame that comes around, especially setting up external boundaries with people, right? Because this may upset someone. And typically when it upsets someone, we now know that we need to have it, but we also now know that we're really going to have to work to reinforce it. Okay? And that's really tough. I'm going to give an example of how to do this. This is when second guessing comes into play and the people pleaser starts to come out. This is why I talked about the people pleaser in the beginning, right? Because so much of that part of our personality, or that part of that exists, is about how can I comfort this other person and lower my needs in order to support this person. And we're not trying to do that. We're trying to actually just focus solely on our needs. 4, insert self-compassion and lots of space for external feelings that come up with doing something different for yourself. Okay, so if we set a boundary externally that looks like I'm no longer going to help this person do Y, right? Whatever Y is a variable. I'm now going to have a little bit more time on my hands. What am I going to do with that energy? What am I going to do with that time? And what's really important here is to really focus on and understand we need to do something it's a defense mechanism, a helpful one called sublimation. We need to find some other type of healthy habit that we can start to lean into. This is where I actually like to take a lot of my coaching clients in, and I'm like, what's something you haven't done in a really long time? What's something you wish you spent more time doing? Because this is really what helps us to be able to identify, okay, if I'm not spending my time doing that, what am I going to spend my time and how am I going to increase my own self-compassion? It's a great time to get into a hobby. Preferably not something that you're trying to accomplish. We're not trying to remodel a home. We're trying to find something that we can engage with a little bit here, a little bit there, not overboard. Number 5, make decisions that surround and provide evidence to back up your boundary. Write them down for when you're needing them. This is where that journaling piece comes out again. Journaling can be so helpful for boundaries, because I also want you to go back. I want you to use that journal to go back and go, wait, why do I need this boundary? Because as time goes on, our brains, our systems, we miss somebody or something looks different, and we kind of go, man, like, maybe I shouldn't have set that boundary. And we start to second guess. But the whole reason that we do the writing in the beginning is so that when we're at that other point, we kind of recognize, like, nope, this was a really important boundary, instead of testing the waters. And this is where a lot of ebb and flow can exist too. It's never that we set up boundaries and everything is just perfect, okay? That doesn't exist. It's a really difficult management system that we have to have flexibility with. Okay, internal. So I'm going to give you an example. And this is one I kind of laid out that I think is common. It's kind of common. So this is the first part, right? I need to set a boundary with my belief about how much I need to get done in one day, right? So this is that expectation that, like, the only way to be productive and achieve things is by doing 20 things in a day. And the reality is that we don't even have time or capacity for that a lot of the times, okay? So we need to lower that list down a little bit. I think I have to complete 20 things to be successful in a day. I feel like I need to alter this because it isn't helpful to me when I need more rest or a day off because I'm not relaxing and I don't know how to sit still. Right? Okay. Always need to be doing. A lot of perfectionists have a really hard time sitting with heavy emotions. I brought this up, right? So now we're starting to tie everything together into a beautiful little package here. A lot of perfectionists also believe that they need to get 40 things done in a day. So now we've just identified why we need to have this boundary, right? Because this person is realizing, this stranger X is realizing this is actually not healthy for me. So this is the internal boundaries that we're working on, just as a reminder. The limit, number 2. So step number 2, we're going to decide on the limit. The limit that needs to be set is that I will plan to work to do let me go back. The limit that needs to be set is that for 2 to 3 days out of the week, I'm going to do a little bit more tasks than I would all 5 days a week. All 5 days a week. I said that too fast, sorry. When we put our to-do lists on the counter, right, and we look at it, it can be really overwhelming. If you plan to have that much stuff to do every single day, you aren't going to have a lot of energy for anything else. So 2 or 3 days out of the week, you're going to go kind of hard. Totally fine. Totally fine. Those are your grind days. No big deal. But the other couple days, we need to have a lot more flexibility. And this is a really good management system. It's a really good boundary. I do this too. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I fill my days a little bit more than I do Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And the reason is because I'm balancing. I'm balancing 2 companies, but I'm also balancing what I need, right? What my needs are. I will be more realistic with the goals, plans, and needs, and space out some of my to-do items so that I do not feel so overwhelmed with tasks and what I am not able to get accomplished. I'm going to hold myself to the expectation that I will do a check-in with myself every morning to see where I am. Great way to set up an internal boundary. As soon as you wake up, the first thing that you start putting your energy into is actually what's going to extend your entire day, right? Think about even having like a bad dream. Like you wake up out of a bad dream and you just cannot shake that dream out. So what's going to happen here is if we wake up in the morning, we go, you know what, Nichole, how we doing? We okay? Neck's a little tight, had a little injury. World's a little shifted right now. People have had a little bit extra needs. How much capacity do we have? And we do this check-in. I love doing this when I'm on the walk with the girls. Like I walk my dogs in the morning and I just do my little check-in with myself. And I decide right in that moment, like, what do I have the capacity for today? And sometimes that might ebb and flow, but most of the time I'm like, okay, this is what I can show up with. And everything extra can be tomorrow's problem, right? We'll figure that out. We'll navigate that day by day, right? This is that temporal boundary. I'm staying right in the temporal boundary here. Number 3, I'm going to find a hobby or project that doesn't offer a ton of results and spends more time doing that. Yoga, painting, listening to music, reading a fiction book. Anything that's not like I need to accomplish and achieve this, but I just want to enjoy it. Baking, cooking, those types of things. Number 4, insert self-compassion. Work on shifting some of the pain into positive energy and relief for the decisions that you're making for yourself. This will get easier. Perfectionists have a really tough time in the beginning setting internal boundaries for themselves, because what they ultimately end up doing is they end up shaming themselves for needing extra time and space and not running as fast as they used to. There's actually a whole part in my course too that goes over the grief of losing perfectionism once we start to make transitions with managing it. And the reasoning for this is because you get so used to high driving all the time. Sometimes it gets really hard that when you switch over your system, you're like, man, like I don't feel like how I used to be able to feel, and I don't run as fast as I used to be able to run. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a loss that's happening here too. So this is where we need to put in a lot of self-compassion. This is where we really need to implement that space of, hey, like it's okay that you don't show up the same way that you used to. We also didn't feel that good when we were doing that. You were also burnt out. You were also not able to show up in your personal life as much. Number 5, reinforce idea and notice when you're backtracking into old habits. It is okay to ebb and flow in step 5. I even have some days too where I'm like, dang, Nick, you need to sit down and stop doing so much. And sometimes it's just because I have high energy and I want to utilize that energy. But when I start to realize too, like I'm not leaving any room for myself for later on, I have to kind of slow down in some of those areas. I have to kind of shift down in some of those areas. It's okay to get off track. It's just about how we're bouncing back from that. Okay, like tomorrow I gotta take my morning to myself. I gotta chill out a little bit. I gotta not overdrive this. Insert more self-compassion, space for your needs. It's okay to go backwards as you navigate internal boundaries. I think internal boundaries are really, really difficult for perfectionists a lot of the times because it's how we're setting the standards with ourselves and how we're hearing ourselves. So it's a multifaceted approach. But I know too, for personally and being a therapist and being a coach and working with a lot of humans, that external boundaries are really, really difficult. And a lot of the times it's because we don't want to affect people. So I picked a really bland example, and then I want to really be able to dive into some of these Q&As with boundaries pieces. So external step 1, I need to set some boundaries with friends or family because I'm feeling, I put in parentheses any of these, but I'm going to read them all out to you. Taken advantage of, exhausted after exchanges. Nothing is really changing, and I'm putting a lot of effort into something. I need to set boundaries with how much I help person X. Okay, that's what's happening. And a lot of the times when I'm working with a client, they will never say this. Because we have a belief system, especially with families and friends, that we are supposed to show up 110% for them every single time. And unfortunately, that's not always hugely realistic. And it's not easy to say that we can't, right? But what starts to happen is that when we bleed over into crossing this boundary, we create a lot more difficulties for ourselves. And so one of the things that I want you to really pay attention here is your capacity. I just had a wonderful conversation with somebody this weekend and we were talking about capacity. And she said to me, she says, I finally understand what you mean by that. She says, I finally have stepped back so far into understanding who I am that I recognize when I can't give more to other people. And when you get to that spot, that is a big shift. And when you can do it with family members and loved ones and interpersonal relationships or romantic relationships, it changes the dynamic, but it also is very, very supportive. Step 2, the next time person X. To be honest with you, it was really hard for me to pick a random person's name because I didn't want it to be anything that anybody was like, oh, I know a Robert. I didn't want to do that. So that's why we have person X. The next time X asks me for help, I'm going to tell him that I cannot do that and I'm not going to offer extra support because I no longer have the capacity to do Y and Z. This is where it feels really kind of squirmy, right? And it can be really difficult. But here's the thing. In our minds, we set up this huge expectation and assumption that this is how people are going to react and respond to us. But the reality is that Their reaction is their reaction. Your reaction is your reaction, right? So if you go into something with a level keeled tone, with a very soft approach, with a way that looks like, hey, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because it's for me. And I don't want to do that. Like it's me, not you kind of thing. But what I want to do is I want you to understand that this is really affecting me. It's going to look a lot different. If you walk in there and you're like, hey, I'm setting a boundary and this is it, never again, it's going to look really different. You know, that reaction is going to come off really different. So pay attention to that piece. This may upset somebody and that is okay. But a lot of the times it looks like, hey, I can't do that for you. And they'll be like, why? Why not? Why can't you do that? It's just, I don't have the capacity to do that. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to. This is the part where we use closed-ended statements, okay? And in therapy world, giving you a therapy trick here, closed-ended statements are just no. No is a sentence. It's just one word, right? No. You don't need to over-explain. You don't need to justify. You don't need to reason anything. You just need to have that moment of, I'm sorry, I cannot do that. And a lot of times you don't even have to say sorry. You just need to say, I can't do that right now. I can't do that. Don't add right now because they might perceive that, okay, well, maybe later. No, I can't do that. One of my favorite communication techniques that I'm going to give you a cheat on before my next presentation is saying okay. And a lot of the times this just means I'm not going to exert too much energy. I'm not going to get upset in this. Whatever that person responds with, sometimes we just need to go, okay. Okay, I heard what you said. And this shifts that whole dynamic, right? Because now we're not fueling a fire to get things ramped up. It can just be okay. What's important is that you keep calm and respectful and utilize closed-ended statements. We're still on part 2. And do not let that person cross the lines you have made. You are not doing anything wrong by setting a boundary. Okay? You're not doing anything wrong by setting a boundary. And honestly, what you're doing here, especially when you're laying it out like this, is that you're giving yourself a lot of evidence to understand there's nothing wrong with having these types of boundaries for your needs. And establishing your limits, right? Making sure we're paying a lot of attention to those limits. Number 3, sit with the discomfort. I make it sound so easy, right? When I say it like that. You may experience guilt and shame, but you are doing this for you. This is for you. Which means that you do not need to compensate in other ways. It's not, if I can't help X move this weekend, I'll send them money and a gift card to get food from the grocery store or do something else. No, it's not. We're not doing that. We're doing, no, X has been asking for too many things. X is needing too many things, and we no longer have the capacity to show up in that way for X. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to just say no. We don't need to compensate in other areas. That guilt and shame is something we have to sit with, right? And a lot of the times I want you to go back to that idea, that thing that I was bringing up earlier about, is that serving you? It's normal to experience these in the beginning, and the better you get at this, the less you'll start to experience that guilt and shame. But at the same time, when you can sit with some of this discomfort for a few minutes and go, is this really serving me? Is this doing anything for me? Is there anything that I'm doing wrong here? No. Typically, no. Unless you were screaming at that person and you purposely tried to make that person physically be hurt or mentally be hurt in some way. Other than that, no, you're not doing anything wrong. Just keep the boundary. The fact that you're here also tells me you're not doing anything wrong because you're trying to learn to do this in a positive, assertive way. Okay, number 4, insert self-compassion. Create a lot of space for yourself with processing these feelings and find something that helps you to release. Okay, this is that one hobby, that activity that's not requiring a lot of doing. It's not requiring a lot of productivity. It's something for you to go and relax in. Maybe this looks like going down to the beach for you. Maybe it looks like going for a long walk with a dog. Maybe it looks like painting. Maybe it looks like playing an instrument. There's a lot of different ways to show up in this capacity. Number 5, re-explore the boundary and reasoning when you need it. So we're going to go back to the journal, okay? And I want you, as you're developing and putting out these boundaries, I want you to write down the reasons that you're doing this. I want you to really pay attention to the ways in which you're showing up within that boundary system, because this type of reinforcement is actually what's going to help you to give that evidence. Think of it as you're a detective, right? And you need to have the evidence that supports why you're doing this. This is a great reason for journaling. We set that boundary because we were uncomfortable in different places and because things weren't working out. And because every time you kept overgiving, the only person that it was costing was you. That's a great reason to have a boundary. There may be times of loneliness and grief surrounding the shedding of this past role, but you need to provide evidence as why you've made these decisions and who they are for. Okay. It's not easy, you guys. I make it sound like it's this like 5-step process, no big deal. It takes a lot of work. It does. And even as somebody who still struggles with it sometimes, it does take a lot of work to even come in and recognize like, oh shoot, I really went over that boundary and I really shouldn't have. And there's nothing wrong with being able to step back and make changes and alterations for how you're showing up. And for the internal boundaries, guys, think about your needs. Think about what you need more of. Because once you start really paying attention to more of those internal boundaries and not overdoing it in certain areas or underdoing it in other areas, it's going to make a huge difference to the way that you show up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this experience I had with setting a capacity boundary with a friend. Great. She got upset with me that I didn't want to talk about something because I found the topic too overwhelming. In the midst of all that was going on in life, she got mad at me and that I wasn't there for her when she wanted to talk, but I knew I didn't have it in me. Good for you. Good for you for standing with that boundary. This happened repeatedly since the pandemic and the election of 2020. Yeah, I did a lot of boundary work during the pandemic. I still am. My thought process is that this actually isn't about you, right? This is about a friend that is needing more than what you're able to give her, and she doesn't find that it's okay for you to just feel uncomfortable with having the conversation. My suggestion would be to have a conversation with her about what capacity actually means to make sure she understands that piece of it. And also, express to her what it does to you. It's not required, but sometimes it can be helpful to say like, hey, when we have this conversation about the election, or we have this conversation about religion, or we have this conversation about, I don't know, this TV show that stresses me out, this is what I internally feel. And that's not because of you and I, it's because that's not something that I can hold and meet with patients all day, right? This is something too, if you're a giver, you work in the medical field, or you do anything that relates in client-centered work, we have to be very cognizant of our capacity, because a lot of people ask for different types of suggestions and implementation, and it's going to upset people when we don't have that space for them. But it's really important that we work to maintain that boundary. And to be honest with you, I would have done the same thing. I might give a little bit of follow-up on it, but unfortunately, it's not going to always be perfect the way it plays out. That person may come back later though and go, I kind of get why you did that. Like that, she might experience it, or he might experience it in a different way. And that's what brings in that awareness. What do you do when you set up an external boundary? Hi, Lily. And those you set it up for don't honor it. What do you do? So here's the thing, is that sometimes we're going to have to make decisions on different types of relationships dependent on the responses and the ways people react to certain types of boundaries. I had somebody message me on Instagram not too long ago and say that she was struggling with some boundaries and difficulty with an interpersonal relationship, and that she was getting some flack from her therapist, who was saying it wasn't okay for her to set that boundary with that parent, right? Because this is a parent situation. And I apologized to her. I said, I'm really sorry you had that experience. A lot of the times when we're actually exiling people out of our life for specific reasons, a lot of that is due to them not honoring our boundaries, right? Is that we just need to keep separating ourselves from that person. There is nothing wrong with this. It is not the first step in the process, guys. We have 5 steps over here. And then there's a lot of emotional processing that comes out of this. And a healthy relationship is going to come back, and it's going to have resiliency within that area. It's going to bounce back in different ways. But in some of these other unhealthy relationships, there's nothing wrong with you setting a boundary and needing to reinforce it. And that may mean that you lose parts of that relationship because that person cannot honor it. If we set a boundary where somebody is not honoring that piece of the boundary, the most important thing, and this is why the follow-up to this webinar is going to be all about communication, is to re-communicate why it's important, right? And really help to instill the importance of that boundary. There's a lot of teasing culture and there's a lot of joking around. And especially when people learn about different type of psychological words, or they learn that you like certain types of words, oh, well, is this a boundary for you? And they'll make like a joke out of it. And the reality is to really come back to that closed statement thing of, hey, like this actually isn't okay. And this is really bothering me. And if you don't, discontinue and maintain and honor this boundary for me, I'm going to have to step away from you a little bit further. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't mean that in a threatening sense. I don't mean that in like a, hey, we're never going to be friends again sense. I just mean it in, I need to step further away from you if you're not willing to take out that time for me and help me and support me. What's a good way to shut someone down that's asking for details on why you can't help right now? I love this question. When no isn't enough for them. Okay, well, the first one is I don't have the capacity for that, right? Like, I don't have the capacity to do that. That's it. Done. But the second piece of this can also be your firmness with this isn't going to happen, right? And I want you to think of it too as like parent-child relationship, right? And just in any sense, not like your parent-child relationship or anything along those lines, but just in a parent-child relationship, that authority and whatever. Parent says like, I say no because I'm the mom and I'm allowed to do these types of things. That's the authority principle coming off. We're not trying to do that when we're talking to a friend or a colleague and they're not understanding the details on it. What I like to do and what I find the most helpful is it's not important. The details are not important. I will not be able to attend to that. The details are not important. No. And to be very frank with you, the thing that is actually going to perpetuate this the most to actually be activated to work is being very, 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 very firm with close-ended statements. With no, I cannot do that. And it's really hard. It's an assertive tool. It's an assertive communication technique. And it means that you're going to have to lower the amount of other things that are going on for you internally in order to reinforce that. It's not an easy process. It also depends on who you're communicating with. You're not this person's parent. You're not going to say because I said so and be really rude and offensive. But what you are going to do is you're going to go, no, I can't. And that could be the end of it. And that person that keeps pushing, you start to end that conversation. You owe no explanation. Not everybody is allowed to have access to you and everything that you're working on. Okay, interpersonally, mentally, emotionally. Thank you so much for attending tonight, guys. I really appreciate it. The next webinar is going to be on the 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to talk about communication techniques. I'm going to give away a whole bunch of the ones that are my absolute favorite. If you guys have anything, any needs at all, please reach out to me. Additionally, I am enrolling for my group coaching program at this time, hopefully to start at the end of April, beginning of May. If you're interested in enrolling or doing a strategy call with me, please go on my Instagram. The link's in my bio. You can book a free call with me. We can chat for an hour, no obligation, but we can see if you'd be a great fit. This is where I like putting like-minded individuals, perfectionists, high achievers into the same group to be able to support each other with shared vulnerability. And it's only 6 weeks. I'm thinking that the meetings are going to be Thursday evenings or Tuesday evenings, probably like 7 Eastern time, just for people that are located all around the world, so they have some kind of idea. Thanks, guys. Have a great evening. I hope to see you next time. Please let me know if this was helpful.